I still remember the exact moment I realized my marriage was a performance I had been rehearsing alone. It wasn't during the argument, it wasn't during the divorce, it was at a dinner table in front of 13 people who all looked away when I needed someone to look at me. My name is Claire Bennett, and for 9 years I was the kind of wife people described as patient, steady, and easy to get along with. Looking back now, I understand those words were never compliments. They were just polite ways of saying I never caused a scene. And in my marriage, not causing a scene was the most important rule of all. I met Daniel when I was 26. He was charming in that effortless, room-brightening way that makes you feel lucky just to be near someone. He worked in commercial real estate development in the Nashville area, always in motion, always pitching something, always 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. I was a financial compliance analyst, the kind of person who reads the fine print, cross-references the numbers, and flags what doesn't add up. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party, and he called me the most interesting person there. I believed him. In the beginning, we worked. He was spontaneous, and I was structured. He dreamed big, and I made sure the details held. People told us we balanced each other out. What I didn't understand then was that balance only works when both sides carry equal weight. In our marriage, the balancing was always mine to do. Small things shifted first, the way they always do. Decisions I thought we'd make together would already be made by the time he mentioned them. We're going to my parents' place this weekend, he'd say on a Thursday night, not as a question. I'd rearrange my plans and tell myself that flexibility was part of love. When I tried to bring it up, Daniel would tilt his head slightly and smile. "You're overthinking it, Claire. Why do you always have to make things complicated?" And, because I loved him and wanted it to work, I'd let it go. Then there was his sister, Melissa. She was 3 years older than Daniel, louder than anyone else in any room, and absolutely convinced that her opinions were public service announcements. She'd married into serious money, old Tennessee family money, and she wore that fact like a badge she'd personally earned. From our very first Thanksgiving together, she had a way of speaking to me that was technically polite but functionally cruel. "Oh, Claire, still doing the compliance thing? That's so stable," she'd say, drawing out the last word like it tasted bitter. The table would laugh softly. Daniel would squeeze my hand under the tablecloth, which I used to think meant he was on my side. Eventually, I understood it meant sit still and take it. I kept mental notes of every incident the way my job trained me to document irregularities. The time Melissa told Daniel in front of his entire family that he deserved someone with more drive. The time she referred to our home as Daniel's house, twice, in the same conversation. The time she pulled Daniel aside at a 4th of July cookout and I watched his posture change completely, watched him come back to me quieter, more distant, for the rest of the evening. When I tried to talk to Daniel about it later that night, he sighed the specific sigh I had come to dread. "She's just direct, Claire. That's how she is. You know how sensitive you get around her." That word, sensitive, was his favorite redirection. It meant your feelings are the problem, not the behavior that caused them. So I adjusted. I laughed at the comments. I deflected the jabs with grace. I became an expert at swallowing things whole and smiling immediately after. Daniel called me the easiest person he'd ever been with. I used to feel proud of that. Now I know it just meant I had made myself the smallest possible version of myself to fit inside the life he wanted. What I didn't know then, what I had no reason to suspect on any of those quiet, humiliating evenings, was that beneath everything I thought I understood about our marriage, there was a financial secret so calculated and so deliberate that when I finally uncovered it, I couldn't breathe for a full minute. But that discovery didn't come until the night of the anniversary dinner. The night Daniel finally said the quiet part out loud. The night everything I had been swallowing came back up all at once. And I was ready. The invitation said it was a celebration. 41 years of marriage, Daniel's parents, Gerald and Patricia Bennett, renewing their vows in front of the people they loved most. The card was cream-colored with gold lettering, the kind that feels expensive between your fingers. I remember holding it and feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not excitement. Something closer to dread. I told myself I was being irrational. It was a family dinner, not a courtroom. I pressed my dress the night before, practiced being pleasant in the bathroom mirror, and reminded myself that one evening was survivable. I had survived plenty of them before. I was good at it by then. We arrived at Gerald and Patricia's home in Franklin, Tennessee, just outside Nashville, a wide colonial with a wraparound porch and the kind of landscaping that gets compliments from strangers. The house was warm and lit beautifully, long tables dressed in white linen, candles placed just so, the smell of something rich coming from the kitchen. 13 other people filtered in around us, cousins, family friends, Daniel's aunt and uncle from Knoxville. Everyone dressed well, smiling on cue, performing the version of themselves they saved for occasions like this. I sat beside Daniel, folded my hands in my lap the way I always did, and told myself to just get through the evening. Melissa arrived 20 minutes late. She never arrived on time. Lateness was one of her power moves, a way of making the room reorganize itself around her entrance. She walked in wearing something that probably cost more than our monthly electric bill, her husband Kevin trailing just behind her, looking the way he always looked at these things, vaguely uncomfortable, vaguely elsewhere. She made her rounds, kissing cheeks, laughing at her own comments before she finished making them, and when she finally reached me she paused just long enough to make it theatrical. "Claire," she said, tilting her head. "You look tired. Is work still so demanding?" I smiled. "I'm great, Melissa, thank you." She moved on before I finished the sentence. Dinner began smoothly enough. Gerald gave a toast that was genuinely moving, talking about choosing your partner every single day, about what it means to build something real with another person. I felt Daniel's hand find mine on the table, and for a moment, a brief foolish moment, I let myself feel hopeful. Then Melissa set down her wine glass. She did it slowly and deliberately, the way people do when they're about to say something they've been saving. She looked down the table toward me and smiled, that particular smile of hers that never once reached her eyes. "So Claire," she began, because it was always Claire, always me, always the opening act of her favorite performance. "Daniel mentioned you turned down that senior position at your firm. Said you didn't want the extra travel." She paused just long enough. "I just think it's interesting, choosing comfortable over ambitious. But I suppose not everyone has that kind of drive." The table shifted. Not dramatically, just that subtle collective rebalancing that happens when a room senses conflict and decides collectively to pretend it doesn't. I felt heat rise in my face. I kept my expression neutral. "I've made choices that work for our life together," I said evenly. Melissa laughed lightly. "Of course you have." She lifted her wine glass again. Daniel was looking at his plate. And there it was. The same pattern, the same script, just a new audience. Melissa delivers the cut, the table absorbs it quietly, Daniel studies his food, and I smile and redirect and swallow it whole. That was how it was supposed to go. That was the arrangement. But then Melissa kept going. She always pushed one step further than necessary, and that night she decided to push harder than she ever had. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice in that fake confidential way that somehow still carries across an entire table, and said, "I love my brother. I do. I just worry sometimes that he settled. That he chose easy over everything he actually deserved." The word settled landed in my chest like something physical. I looked at Daniel. He finally looked up. And for one second, I thought this was the moment. The moment he would finally say enough. The moment he would choose me the way Gerald had just finished describing in his toast. The moment I had been waiting for without admitting I was waiting for it. Instead, Daniel looked directly at me and said quietly, "Claire, just let it go. Please." Something inside me went completely still. Not the kind of stillness that comes from calm. The kind that comes right before a decision. And then Melissa tilted her head and said sweetly, "You don't mind if I'm honest, do you, Claire? We're family." I opened my mouth. And for the first time in 9 years, I did not perform. What came out of my mouth next would change everything. But what nobody at that table knew yet, what even Daniel didn't fully realize, was that I had not said the most important thing. Not yet. I was still holding the one piece of information that would make the entire room go silent in a completely different way. And I was about 30 seconds away from saying it. I want you to understand something about the moment before I spoke. I was not angry. I know that surprises people when I tell them. They expect me to say I was furious, that something snapped, that I finally lost control after years of holding it together. But that is not what happened. What I felt in that moment was something far more dangerous than anger. It was clarity. The kind that comes when you have been quietly gathering evidence for 14 months and you finally understand exactly what you are looking at. But I did not lead with that. Not yet. I looked at Melissa calmly and said, "You know what I find interesting, Melissa? You have spent 9 years telling this family that you built something remarkable. Your business, your reputation, your success. And everyone at this table has believed you. I believed you too, for a while." The table went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of people being careful. The stunned quiet of people who have never once heard me speak above a whisper at one of these dinners. Melissa blinked. Her smile stayed in place, but something behind her eyes shifted. She laughed softly. "Claire, I was just making conversation. There is no need to be dramatic." Kevin, her husband, went very still beside her. Daniel's hand came to my arm. "Claire," he said, his voice low and tightly controlled. "That is enough. You are embarrassing yourself." I looked at his hand on my arm. Then I looked at his face. And I said something I had never said to him at a family gathering in 9 years. "No, Daniel. I am not done." The sound of someone setting down a fork was the only noise in the room. Daniel's expression shifted from embarrassed to something harder. His jaw tightened. He straightened in his chair and said the words that I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Then let me make this simple for you. Apologize to my sister right now, or you can get out of my house." My house. As though my name were not on the mortgage. As though my income had not covered the property taxes for the last 3 years while his development projects underperformed. As though I had been a guest this whole time and had only just now overstayed my welcome. I heard someone at the far end of the table draw a sharp breath. Patricia, Daniel's mother, pressed her fingers to her lips. Gerald set down his wine glass slowly. Nobody spoke. They were all waiting to see what version of Claire would show up. The one who apologized. The one who cried. The one who made herself small enough to fit back inside the moment. I pushed my chair back from the table. Daniel said my name again, sharper this time, with an edge I recognized, the edge that meant he was genuinely alarmed. But I was already standing. I smoothed the front of my dress. My legs were trembling, but I was standing. I walked around the table slowly and deliberately, and I felt every single pair of eyes following me. Melissa watched me approach her with an expression caught somewhere between amusement and the first trace of something she was not expecting. Uncertainty. I stopped beside her chair. She looked up at me, and for the first time since I had known her, Melissa did not have a prepared line ready. She opened her mouth and then closed it. I said, "I am not here to apologize, Melissa. But I do want to say something to you. In front of everyone. Because this family deserves to hear it." Daniel said my name from across the table like a warning. I kept my eyes on Melissa. I said, "The reason your consulting business has stayed afloat for the last 3 years is not because of your talent or your reputation. It is because my husband has been quietly transferring money from our joint accounts into a shell LLC registered under a variation of your name. Money that was mine. Money that I never approved. Money that I have 14 months of documented transfers to prove." The room did not just go quiet. It collapsed. Melissa's face went the kind of pale that happens when blood actually leaves a person's skin. Kevin stood up so abruptly his chair scraped back loudly against the hardwood floor. "What did you just say?" he asked, and his voice was so controlled it was frightening. Gerald gripped the edge of the table. Patricia made a sound that was not quite a word. Daniel was on his feet. "That is a lie," he said. His voice was loud, but his eyes were terrified. "You're lying. Tell them you're lying." I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. I had screenshots. I always have documentation. It is literally my profession. "I am not lying," I said quietly. "I have transfer records, account numbers, and email confirmations. 14 months worth. And Kevin," I looked directly at him, "your wife has known about every single one." Kevin turned to look at Melissa. And in that moment, watching her face, I understood something I had not expected to feel. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something much heavier and much more honest than that. I felt grief. Grief for the marriage I thought I had. Grief for the years I spent making myself invisible to protect something that was never real. But underneath the grief, steady and unshakable, was something else entirely. Because what nobody in that room knew yet, not even Daniel, was that the financial transfers were only the first layer. There was something else in that documentation. Something that did not just implicate Melissa. Something that would change the way this entire family looked at each other for the rest of their lives. And my attorney already knew about it. I want to tell you what happened in the 30 seconds after I mentioned my attorney, because those 30 seconds revealed more about every person in that room than 9 years of dinners ever had. Kevin sat back down. Not casually, the way someone sits when they are relaxed. The way someone sits when their legs stop working reliably. He placed both hands flat on the table and stared at Melissa with an expression I can only describe as a man watching a building he thought was solid begin to crack down the middle. Melissa was gripping the edge of the tablecloth. Her knuckles were white. The perfectly assembled version of herself she had walked in with was completely gone. Daniel came around the table toward me. He was not aggressive. He was desperate, and desperation on someone who has always been composed is deeply unsettling to witness. He lowered his voice and said, "Claire, whatever you think you found, we can talk about this privately. This is not the place." I looked at him and said, "You chose the place when you told me to apologize or leave in front of 13 people. He flinched. That was the first honest reaction I had seen from him all evening. Then Gerald spoke. He had been so still since I made the revelation that I had almost forgotten he was at the head of the table. He was 71 years old, and he had the kind of stillness that comes from a lifetime of knowing when something is serious. "Daniel," he said, not loudly, just firmly, with the weight of a man who did not repeat himself. "Look at me." Daniel turned. Is what Claire is describing true? The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Daniel said, "Dad, it is complicated." And Gerald said, "That is not what I asked you." Patricia stood up quietly, folded her napkin, placed it beside her plate, and walked out of the dining room without a word. I heard her footsteps go down the hallway toward the kitchen. The sound of a door closing softly behind her. In 41 years of marriage, I imagined she had learned the difference between arguments worth witnessing and ones worth walking away from. This was the latter. Now here is the part one had not told anyone yet. Not even my attorney knew the full scope of what I had found, because the financial transfers were complicated enough on their own, and I had wanted to understand it completely before I said it out loud to anyone. But standing in that room, watching Daniel refuse to answer his father directly, watching Melissa stare at the tablecloth, watching Kevin's hands shake slightly against the white linen, I made the decision to say it. The transfers from our joint account to Melissa's LLC were real and they were significant. But when I dug deeper into the account trail, following it the way my job trained me to follow money through layers of misdirection, I found something else. The LLC that held the transferred funds had a second signatory. Not Melissa. Not Daniel. A name I recognized immediately because I had seen it on documents in Daniel's home office more than once without ever questioning it. His business partner, a man named Todd Reeves, who had been Daniel's closest friend since college and who had been in our home for dinner no fewer than a dozen times. Todd had not just been helping Daniel move money to Melissa. He had been siphoning funds from Daniel's own development projects at the same time. Daniel was not just the one doing the deceiving. He was also being deceived. He had been so focused on hiding money from me that he had not noticed his oldest friend hiding money from him. I said it clearly. I said, "Daniel, there is something else you should know. Todd Reeves is a second signatory on the account receiving our funds. And while you were moving money out of our marriage, he was moving money out of your business." The color that had already left Daniel's face somehow drained further. He said Todd's name like a question. Just the name, nothing else. Kevin stood up again. He looked at Melissa and said, "I need every account number you have access to. Tonight. Right now." Melissa started to speak, and he held up one hand and said, "Do not. Just do not." One of the cousins at the far end of the table quietly got up and took two younger kids out of the room. Smart. The dinner that had been arranged to celebrate 4 decades of commitment had become something no one was going to describe accurately to people who had not been there, because there were no clean words for what was happening. Daniel sat down heavily in the nearest chair, which happened to be someone else's chair, and pressed both hands over his face. He sat like that for a long moment. When he finally looked up at me, his expression was not anger anymore. It was something rawer and more complicated. He said, "Why didn't you just come to me first?" I thought about that question for a moment because it deserved an honest answer. I said, "Because the last time I brought something uncomfortable to you, you told me I was being sensitive. I was not willing to give you the chance to make me doubt myself again." Gerald made a sound from the head of the table. Not a word. Just a low, heavy exhale that carried the weight of a father understanding something about his son that he had not wanted to understand. I picked up my clutch from the table. My hands were steady. I was surprised by that. I had imagined this moment in many different versions over 14 months of quiet documentation, and in none of those versions had I imagined feeling this calm, this grounded, this entirely and completely like myself. I said goodnight to Gerald because he deserved that. He nodded at me slowly, and in his eyes I saw something that caught me off guard completely. It was not embarrassment on behalf of his family. It was not discomfort. It was respect. I walked to the front door. Nobody stopped me. Not one person in that room said a single word as I lifted my coat from the rack, opened the door, and stepped out into the cool Tennessee night. But what was waiting for me on the other side of that door, what I found when I got to my car, was something I had not planned for at all. And it changed the final chapter of everything that came after. Patricia was sitting on the front porch steps. Not crying, not on her phone, not performing distress for an audience. Just sitting quietly in the cool night air with her hands folded in her lap, still in her dinner dress, looking out at the dark front yard the way someone looks at something they have been thinking about for a long time. I stopped when I saw her. I genuinely did not know what to do with that image. This woman had just watched her anniversary dinner collapse in real time, and she was sitting on her own porch steps like she was waiting for a bus. She looked up when she heard the door. She patted the step beside her. I sat down. I do not know why. Maybe because after everything that had just happened inside that house, the quiet out here felt necessary. Maybe because something in her expression told me this was not an ambush. It was an invitation. She did not speak right away. We sat together for almost a full minute before she said, "I knew something was wrong." Not the specifics. But I knew. She paused. A mother always knows when her son is carrying something he should have put down a long time ago. I did not respond because I did not know what response was right. She continued. "I also knew what Melissa has been doing to you at these dinners. I want you to know that I knew, and I said nothing, and I am deeply sorry for that. I was not expecting an apology from anyone that night, least of all from Patricia Bennett, the woman I had always assumed was simply loyal to her children above all else." I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not realized was still tight. I told her I appreciated that. I meant it. She reached over and briefly touched my hand. Then she stood up, smoothed her dress, and went back inside. No dramatic speech, no lengthy explanation. Just an acknowledgement, clean and honest and long overdue. It was the most dignified thing anyone in that family had done all evening. I sat there alone for another few minutes before I got in my car and drove to a hotel off the interstate, the kind with a small desk lamp and a window that looks out over a parking lot and nothing else. I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not with panic, not with regret, just with the honest understanding that my life, as I had known it, was over, and that was not entirely a tragedy. The next morning, I called my attorney before I called anyone else. She had already received 3 voicemails from Daniel's lawyer by 8 in the morning. She told me to say nothing to anyone and let her handle the noise. I told her there was one more detail I had not fully briefed her on yet, the involvement of Todd Reeves and the secondary layer of financial fraud that implicated Daniel not just as a perpetrator, but also as a victim. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Claire, you are either the most thorough person I have ever represented or the calmest." I told her it was honestly just my job. What followed over the next several months was not a clean or simple process. Divorces never are, especially when money is tangled and egos are wounded and lawyers are involved on multiple sides simultaneously. Daniel hired representation immediately. So did Kevin, separately from Melissa, which told you everything you needed to know about the state of that marriage. Todd Reeves, once confronted with the documentation I had compiled, hired a criminal defense attorney within 48 hours. The financial review that followed pulled in 3 separate cases that were ultimately handled by 2 different firms and 1 state regulatory body. I was deposed twice. Both times I answered every question directly, without hesitation, without embellishment. Just facts, dates, account numbers, transfer records. The same way I had been doing my job for 11 years. My attorney told me afterward that the opposing counsel had expected me to crack under pressure and that my composure had genuinely unsettled them. I took that as the highest possible compliment. The divorce settlement took 7 months to finalize. Because joint assets had been misused without my consent, and because the documentation supported that clearly, the outcome protected my financial position entirely. I walked away with my retirement accounts intact, my credit clean, and my professional reputation untouched. Daniel walked away considerably diminished, financially and otherwise. The situation with Todd cost him far more than the divorce did, in legal fees, in lost business partnerships, in the kind of public professional embarrassment that follows a person in a mid-sized city like Nashville for years. Melissa and Kevin separated before the year was out. I heard through someone who had been at that dinner that the separation was not entirely related to what I had revealed that night, that there had been other fractures underneath, long-standing ones. That did not surprise me. These things rarely start the night they become visible. I found a small apartment in East Nashville with tall windows and a kitchen that gets the morning light. I planted herbs on the windowsill. I started sleeping without that low, constant hum of anxiety that I had lived with so long I had stopped recognizing it as anxiety and had started calling it just how I am. It was not how I am. It was how I had learned to survive. I went back to work and I was good at it, the way I had always been good at it, except now without the background noise of someone else's voice in my head telling me I was too analytical, too sensitive, too much. I mentored 2 younger women at my firm that year, both of them sharp and uncertain in that particular way that tells you someone has been taught to doubt their own instincts. I recognized it immediately. I tried to give them what nobody gave me for a long time. The simple confirmation that what they were seeing was real. Daniel reached out once, about 8 months after the divorce was finalized. A text message, 3 sentences long, that said he hoped I was doing well and that he wished things had ended differently. I read it twice. Then I set my phone down and made myself a cup of coffee and stood at my kitchen window watching the morning light come through and did not respond. Not out of bitterness. Out of clarity. There was simply nothing left to say that the truth had not already said better. Here is what I know now that I did not know when I was smoothing my dress before family dinners and practicing being pleasant in bathroom mirrors. Silence is not the same thing as peace. Endurance is not the same thing as strength. And a marriage that only functions when one person disappears is not a marriage. It is a disappearing act. The night I stood up from that table, I was terrified. My legs were shaking and my heart was loud in my ears, and I did not know what was going to happen next. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done shrinking. I was done apologizing for things I had not done. I was done making myself the smallest version of myself so that everyone else in the room could feel comfortable. You do not owe anyone your silence. You do not owe anyone a false apology to keep a broken piece intact. And if telling the truth costs you something, look carefully at what you are losing, because anything that could only survive on your silence was never really yours to begin with. I stood up that night, and I have not sat back down since.